Although this course focuses primarily on the establishment and development of the United States, there are some fundamental ideas to review concerning the indigenous peoples with whom the United States continued to struggle until the late 19th century, and the foundations for the U.S. established during colonial times. This unit will explore several of these key ideas. It is important for you to consider those events that resonate in the short term and today. Use the essential questions, objectives, and key terms to help you remain focused on those things for which you are to be held accountable. Take time to read through these essential questions. As you do so, ask yourself why we are asking these questions. Notice how all of them help shape your understanding of how the United States emerges and introduces you to themes that continue to shape our national identity, including economic motivations, religious freedom, and differences between regions. You will be expected to be able to answer these questions in open response format or during class discussion. When doing so, include specific historical detail gathered from this presentation and from any independent study. As I've mentioned before, much of what this unit includes is outside the scope of the US 1 curriculum, but it is important to review as there are key themes introduced here that reemerge throughout our history. You might recall some of this information from previous grades, but let's take some time to review and start building your foundation of understanding. Take a few moments to read through these objectives and think about what you recall and how they might affect the establishment and development of the United States. Write down any questions that you have or thoughts that pop into your mind as you consider these objectives. These represent the key points that we expect you to know by the end of the unit. Okay. These are the key terms you are expected to know by the end of the unit. They are few, considering how much information is going to be presented in the course of this presentation. Use the key terms presented to help you focus in on the important information. But do not fall into the trap. You are expected to know not only the definition of each term, but you also need to understand how each of these key terms helps you analyze the important themes of this unit. A term like indigenous links to the broader themes of the native peoples who inhabited the continent prior to European colonization and the struggles between these groups thereafter. Go beyond simply defining the word and understand its context. Dates matter when studying history, though placing an event in the correct time period rather than recalling a specific date is often sufficient in explaining a bigger idea. With this set of dates, you may ask which ones you must recall. Two things should guide you. First, this is a course in U.S. history, and the U.S. emerges from the English colonies. Because of this, French and Spanish events noted on this list may be less important to your later understanding of U.S. history. Secondly, you are residents of Medfield and of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, so some events are more relevant to your understanding of your home, town, and state. Consider these as you determine where to focus. This timeline also lays out the scope of the unit, and if you consider the events carefully, you should start to find answers to some of the essential questions. Consider the first and last states associated with the English colonies. It tells you that over 125 years the colonies were started and expanded. Also, by considering event like the Act of Union of 1707, it helps answer the question about why we use the adjective English and then switch to the adjective British. After 1707, Great Britain was the official name of the organizing government of the nation. It had grown from England to include Scotland and Wales. Please take time to read through these events and make a note of any questions you have or any insights you may glean that you might share in class. All right. Part 1 of this unit focuses on some of the events from pre-Columbian times up until the English colonies were established. There will be a short knowledge check for you to complete on Google Forms when you are done. Be sure to continue to take notes, but break up each section as we go through it. Long before the New World was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492, there were a number of diverse indigenous cultures in North and South America. The Inca civilization, not pictured on this map, spread throughout the Andean region from Colombia to Chile. In Central America, the Aztec and Maya had the most advanced civilizations in that they were large permanent settlements, cities. They left written records and had other attributes that many of the cultures in North America did not. Many of the North American cultures were hunter-gatherers that established semi-permanent settlements that remained viable only as long as the resources existed to support them. For example, in the Southwest, the cliff dwellers built villages that remained in place for centuries, one of the most famous being Mesa Verde, but abandoned them as water became scarce. Each of the regions listed in this map contained numerous tribes that traded and fought and interacted over the course of hundreds of years. Most tribes were mostly self-sufficient, and everyone had a specific role in the society. Remember that they did not have access to the horse until it was reintroduced to the Americas by the Spanish in the 16th century. With the arrival of the horse, migratory patterns changed and tribes shifted between regions and trade increased. Historians rely on archaeological findings to puzzle out how these North American societies interacted and lived. Non-indigenous diseases, smallpox for example, ravaged the indigenous populations of the Americas. Many historians approximate that 90% of the indigenous people died from diseases introduced by Europeans. As the Native American population declined precipitously, tribes had to adapt, sometimes by migrating, sometimes by becoming more reliant on the growing European presence. It is important to note the wealth of diversity among the indigenous people. We will touch very little on these cultures because many were decimated by disease and few left written records. Recent scholarship has expanded our understanding of these cultures and is a rich and interesting area for independent study. Many of the tribal nations have taken advantage of the internet to tell their stories. Although it is beyond the scope of this class, it is important to remind you that Columbus didn't discover the New World, but his discovery of Hispaniola opened up the European colonization of the Americas. North America had long been known to the French, Scandinavians, and English because of the tremendous cod fisheries which remained active until the 20th century, when the stocks were overfished and are now depleted. Fishermen from these areas would arrive, fish, come to land to dry their catch, and return to Europe. There are several archaeological sites confirming this, though doubt still exists as to the extent of the interactions that Europeans had with the Americas before Columbus. And of course, the best known early explorer was the Viking Leif Erikson, who likely sailed to eastern Canada, Vinland, from Iceland and Greenland during the early 11th century. In looking at the North Atlantic, actually the entire Atlantic, it is interesting to consider the distances between different points and the possibilities of people migrating between these landmasses. In the north, especially, it is easy to see how an expedition might go from Scandinavia through the Faroe Islands to Iceland to Greenland and then to North America. These are ideas you may have explored in earlier courses, but for the purposes of our survey course, it's important is that migration, exploration, and discovery did not just begin in 1492. Always consider cause and effect and events that may have preceded ones you are studying. History is an inexact science, and new findings constantly fill in missing details. European exploration, conquest, and colonization was driven by many things. 3 words, though, encapsulate the primary motivations: gold, God, and glory. Gold represents the economic motivations, God the religious, and glory the personal. This map picks up and tells the story of the European exploration of the Americas. This came after efforts to sail around southern Africa to locate new routes to Asia. The competition for access to natural resources and markets are key themes to remember when studying any history, including U.S. history. Trade and access to these resources led to economic growth and profit. Portugal, Spain, France, the Netherlands, also known as the Dutch, and the English were at a disadvantage to the city-states of Naples, Florence, and Venice, who had direct access to the Arab ports along the eastern Mediterranean that controlled the trade routes to the Orient. The continual struggle between Christian Europeans and the Muslim Ottomans also created difficulties in trade. Therefore, the northern and western European nations looked to go around Africa and later east across the Atlantic. West across the Atlantic, sorry. Columbus's journey was part of this effort. After Columbus's discovery, the different monarchies focused on different parts of the Americas. Different countries sponsored different explorers and laid claims to different territory. The Spanish failed to lay claim to areas north of where Columbus landed before the French and English and the Dutch had made their own claims, which influenced this area's later development. In many ways, it was a first-come, first-served system where competing claims were either negotiated or resulted in armed conflict. All of these nations sought to exploit the natural resources of the Americas and continued to search for a water route to Asia. Along with trade, religion drove the conquest and colonization efforts. Many sought to spread Christianity to the indigenous peoples of the Americas through missionary work. After the Reformation began in 1517 and England broke with Rome in 1531, religious competition added to the impetus for exploration. Protestant colonies were established by the English, while the French and Spanish colonies remained Catholic. And little toleration existed between a colony's established religion and other religions. Both sides continued to seek converts, but to their form of Christianity. Many of the men who led the expeditions did so to make their mark on history, for their own glory. Others did it for the glory of their king or queen, and for their religion. It did not take long before the Americas were divided among the European powers. Spain laid claim first with the arrival of Columbus and later conquistadors, though Spain remained focused on the Aztec and Incan empires and the silver and gold that they exported back to Spain. Coronado led an expedition from Mexico as far north as the Mississippi River, exploring the southwest part of the continent. Santa Fe in current-day New Mexico was established in 1607. The Spanish also established the first and now oldest settlement in North America at St. Augustine in Florida in 1565. They never pushed to settle these areas in large numbers, as that was not part of their colonial plan. They remained concentrated in Central and South America because of the vast silver deposits of the Andes and other natural resources there. Their missionaries did spread far and wide, and reminders of that history are found throughout California along the Camino Real. Think about how today's borders do not reflect this deep history, interaction of cultures. This map shows how North America came to be divided between Spain, France, and England. Only the English sent large numbers of migrants to this part of the Americas, establishing 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. France gained its claims through the explorations of Champlain and others. Like the Spanish, the French also did not promote migration to the New World, in part because Kings Louis XIV and XV did not want their Protestant Huguenot dissidents to leave France. France's colonial focus was mostly economic, focused on trade, primarily beaver pelts. These traders worked with the Native American tribes to trap and skin the beaver. As this industry flourished, it had a negative impact on the traditional way of life for the Native Americans and contributed to their decline. Work that had been focused on planting and gathering was now focused on hunting beaver and preparing beaver pelts. This economic dependence on European traders changed Native American societies in many tribes. The English also became active in the fur trade, but as quickly depleted the animal populations, more English arrived. Permanent French settlements were established in Quebec and Montreal, with forts throughout the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley region, the most famous being at Detroit. The French interaction with the Native Americans tended to be more accepting, and aside from the economic impact on various tribes, there was little conflict between the French and Native Americans. The English, though, took a completely different approach to colonization than did the French, and this is the focus of this unit. Notice on this map how England, which became Great Britain in 1707, had the smallest territory, but within a very short period of time had established permanent, thriving colonies up and down the Atlantic coast. Okay, so that's the end of part one, the review of a massive amount of history that puts us at the brink of English colonization. At this time, complete the questions in the Google form. called Unit 1 Comprehension Check 1 to English Colonization. Remember that this slideshow is available to you on the shared folders and in Google Classroom. Also pay attention to what comprehension checks are asking you to focus on. While you are responsible for all the information presented, these questions focus on many of the more important aspects of the lesson. There will be a comprehension check after each part. Welcome back. Please remember that this is a survey course, which means that the topics covered will be numerous with less depth than in a non-survey course. If there is a topic that sparks an interest, use the internet to search out more information. Wikipedia will provide general background information, while other sites will take you as deeply as you wish to go. On to part 2. In this section, we'll explore the motivations behind several of the colonies established by the English along the Atlantic coast in North America. As we do so, think about how the different regions were similar and different, what bound them together and what divided them. As you learn how different colonies evolved, consider if these differences continue today. Think about similarities and differences between states, what binds them together into one nation, and what divides them. The chart on this slide lays out the timeline of English colonization. Take a few moments to read through this chart and consider what it tells you about English colonization. Here's a bit of trivia. Before Jamestown, there was an earlier effort to establish a permanent settlement in the Americas by the English. This lost colony, Roanoke, was located on the Barrier Islands off of North Carolina, and it disappeared without a trace. One year the settlers were there. A couple of years later, when the resupply ship finally came back, there was nothing left except the cryptic message Croatan, carved into a tree. What happened to this colony is a mystery, though recent archaeological findings may shed light onto the mystery. It would be another 30 years until the first permanent English settlement was established at Jamestown. Consider this quote and what Winthrop, the founder of Boston, meant by saying that Boston and its inhabitants would be as a city upon a hill, with the eyes of all people upon us. Many today often refer back to this quote when speaking of the U.S. as being exceptional, a leader, and sometimes when reflecting upon its trials. Take a few minutes to write down some thoughts about this quote, which we will discuss in class. The first permanent English settlement was at Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. This effort was organized for economic gain. The English had seen how well Spain had been doing and sought out their own gold fields and other natural resources. They also sought a northwest passage to Asia. The Virginia Company formed to raise the capital needed to supply the expedition and to resupply it once it had been settled. They were granted a charter by the king, which outlined its territorial claims as well as its rules and organizing principles. This was not a one-shot deal, but was planned as an ongoing venture. They outfitted a ship, recruited men to establish a settlement, and set it on its way. As this was to be primarily a trading post, the men who went lacked the skills that would become most important to them: farming. There was a mix of artisans, soldiers, and fortune seekers who struggled to work well together when things became difficult. The settlers established the colony in a swampy area that was disease-ridden. Death by starvation and disease was common during the first year of the colony. This period was known as the starving time. The colony nearly failed, but under the leadership of John Smith and with the assistance of the local indigenous tribe, the Powhatans, the colony survived. The Indians provided assistance, in part due to the marriage of Pocahontas to one of the colony's leaders, John Rolfe. Unfortunately for the Powhatans, Jamestown soon sought to expand, which led to conflict between the two groups as they competed over land and resources. The Powhatans attacked in 1622, but by that time the colony had grown too strong and it survived. The Powhatans declined while the English colony expanded and prospered. The colony of Virginia quickly expanded beyond Jamestown, establishing a healthier town and more permanent settlement at Williamsburg. They established the first colonial legislature called the House of Burgesses, where elected representatives of the people created laws. Virginia also imported African slaves into the colony. Both of these events occurred in 1619. Remember that the goal of the Virginia expedition was economic gain, and this proved hard to realize. The Virginia Company's goal was profit, and if the colony could not provide income for the company, they would struggle to pay for resupply ships and the sending of additional colonists. There was no gold or anything of worth that the colony could send back until John Rolfe and others recognized that tobacco might prove profitable. This leaf, pictured here, became popular in England and elsewhere, and the success of the colony was assured. Tobacco became the first cash crop of the English colonies, soon to be joined by rice and indigo, which were grown in the warmer climates of the Carolinas. Cash crops are crops grown primarily for export to another market. Some is consumed and traded locally, but most was shipped to England and its colonies. Tobacco became the economic driver of not only Virginia, but also Maryland, North Carolina, and Delaware. The southern colonies included Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. They were initially linked by climate and economics, but over time they also shared many cultural and social characteristics. Because cash crops were so important to these colonies, plantations became the central economic and social organizing factor throughout the rich lands along the Piedmont area near the coasts. Plantations generally consisted of one main house and a compound that contained quarters for laborers, storage buildings, and other artisan workshops necessary for production of the cash crops. These buildings would be surrounded by fields. Plantations were mostly self-sufficient, so few towns were established throughout these colonies. There were other settlers who did not own plantations. Subsistence farming dominated the settlements carved out of the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Few settled beyond the mountains until the middle of the 18th century. These were poorer immigrants, often Scots-Irish, who were looked down upon by the English settlers in the Piedmont area. Both groups were Protestant, but the English were Anglican, members of the Church of England, while the other settlers were of different Calvinist denominations that often suffered persecution at the hands of the English monarchy. The plantation owners maintained its power, in the colonies, for they had the wealth and controlled the politics. In many ways, the plantation owners thought of themselves as aristocrats. Another difference between the subsistence farmers and the plantation owners was labor. On the smaller farms, the owners generally farmed their own land. On the plantations, indentured servants were initially used, replaced over time by slaves. Look up the definition of indentured servant and note the source of your definition. We will take time in class to discuss the different forms of labor in the southern colonies and to consider how slavery supplanted indentured servitude as the preferred labor organization. This depiction of a plantation illustrates the various activities that went on there. These were self-sufficient entities that had their own workshops and such. In other colonies, towns came to be the dominant social and economic structure, but in the South it was the plantation. Take a moment to note the different activities that are depicted here. We will analyze this image together in class as well. Consider this essential question that applies to the South, though remember that slavery existed in all 13 English colonies. What is slavery, and how did slavery develop into the primary source of labor in the plantation economy? Again, we will discuss this further together in class. Although Jamestown and Virginia became the most important of the southern colonies, there are several other interesting points to note about several of the other southern colonies. Maryland was established by Lord Baltimore, who included the tolerance of Catholics in his colony's charter. Many of the other colonies did not tolerate different religions or even different forms of Protestantism. Remember that in England, throughout the 17th century, the Catholics battled with the Protestants after Elizabeth I passed the throne to James I. Charles I was beheaded during the English Civil War. Charles II was suspected of having Catholic leanings, and James II was finally overthrown by William and Mary during the Glorious Revolution, in part because of his Catholicism. Charleston, originally named Charlestown, became the center of South Carolina and one of the most important cities of the 13 colonies, along with Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. As you'll see in a later slide, these cities were very small by today's standards, but they were centers of trade, culture, and politics. Georgia, the last of the 13 colonies, was established by James Oglethorpe in 1733 as a place for convicts, many from debtor prisons from Great Britain. It was a social experiment and somewhat altruistic in its goals, giving destitute people a new chance, although those destitute people were forced to relocate to Great Britain to the colonies, from Great Britain to the colonies against their will. These colonies were linked by their Englishness, their customs, their history, their religion, and the cash crop economy. Those outside the elite were not necessarily persecuted, but neither were they welcome. Take another moment to consider the information that this image provides. What other products were valuable to the southern colonies? The northern colonies consisted of New England, the middle Atlantic colonies. Economically, these colonies were linked by their focus on trade rather than cash crops. They tended to organize in towns and did not have plantations. The vast majority of people were farmers, though there were lawyers, bankers, merchants, and artisans as well. Indentured servants and slaves worked throughout the northern colonies as well, though they tended to be domestic servants rather than farmhands. Most of the farm labor was done by the owner and his family, hiring additional laborers as needed. The farming was better in the middle colonies, especially in Pennsylvania, because of the climate and the soil. In New England, the surplus was rarely enough to trade outside of the immediate area, though it was sufficient to feed larger towns like Boston. The northern colonies traded natural resources needed by England and others, resources such as trees for making ships, rope, and fish. These raw materials were sent to England, and in return, English merchants sent finished products such as china, furniture, and clothes. Through this trade, the colonists remained integrated into the empire. The latest fashions made their way west across the Atlantic as those with money arranged for their agents to ship goods, or merchants imported the latest goods into cities like Philadelphia. Take a look at the image on this page and identify those items that might have been imported from England and those that might have been made locally. What does this image tell us about colonial life in a northern house? A few additional historical notes about the mid-Atlantic colonies before we shift the focus to New England. The Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam, which was the original European settlement on the island of Manhattan, was conquered by the English in 1664 and renamed New York. They also conquered several Swedish settlements in the area that became known as New Jersey and Delaware. This diversity remained an important difference between these colonies and others. Pennsylvania was established by William Penn in 1682. Penn was a Quaker, a Christian sect that was sometimes persecuted in England. Because of this persecution and his own beliefs, Pennsylvania's charter became the most tolerant of all the colonies. All religions were allowed to practice in peace. Also, Native Americans were treated fairly, and there was very little conflict between settlers and the Indians. Large numbers of German Quakers settled in Pennsylvania, enough to support several German-language newspapers into the late 18th century. This German population, along with the Swedish and Dutch populations from New York and New Jersey, contributed to this region's diversity. Before shifting to New England, it is important to remind you that although we speak of cities during the colonial time period, they were relatively small. Most people lived in small towns or on plantations. Notice that New York and Philadelphia continued to grow quickly throughout this period, whereas Boston started to level off in the 1720s. Notice also that Charleston and Newport were large cities at the time. Take a moment to locate these cities on a map, and notice that all were port cities, and except for Newport, were located on large rivers that connected them to the interior of the colony. Think about how the Charles River would have connected Medfield to Boston at that time. Okay, this is the end of part 2. At this time, please complete the comprehension check titled Unit 1 Comprehension Check 2, English Colonies. Welcome back again. Let's begin part 3, which focus on the colonies that become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Maps are very helpful in learning history because they provide a lot of detail through an image. Take a moment to review these two maps and think about what Massachusetts looks like today and what it looked like in the 17th and 18th centuries. Look at the dates of the cities established throughout New England at the beginning of the 17th century. Although Plymouth gets the honor of being the first settlement in the area, and second in all of the English territory, Portsmouth, Boston, and towns as far west as Hartford and south as New Haven were founded within 15 years. Take a close look at this map and consider the tensions that existed as new colonies formed. Remember that this is a survey course and we don't have time to delve deeply into the history of colonial America, but think about all of the complexities of human relationships and consider how they might have played out in colonial times. The story of the Pilgrims may be familiar to you from elementary school. They were separatists who challenged certain basic tenets of the Church of England, which led to persecution and exile to the Netherlands. The leaders of this group decided that the best chance that their community had to flourish was to leave Holland and Europe and to establish a colony in which they would be free to practice their religion as they wanted. They were originally to settle in the northern part of the Virginia colony, near where New York City lies today, but bad weather and other factors led them to put ashore on Cape Cod in Provincetown. There were originally 2 ships, but the Speedwell had to turn back. Ultimately, 102 people traveled in the Mayflower for 66 days, arriving on November 11th, 1620. Now, think about the difficulties these families faced. They arrived in a foreign land at the beginning of winter. They were sick, hungry, and lost. They had to find a good location to establish their settlement. Unlike the Jamestown settlers, the Pilgrims, as they came to be called, were a mixture of families and adventurers. They had to work together to ensure their survival. Hence, they agreed on the Mayflower Compact. They established their colony near today's Plymouth, meeting the Wampanoag Indians along the way. The Pilgrims survived that first winter by eating lobster, locating hidden winter stores set aside by Native Americans. The Pilgrims also noted evidence of recently abandoned villages, the result of an epidemic that killed many of the local tribes. During these first years, the Wampanoags, led by Massasoit, welcomed the Pilgrims, and the two worked together well, helping to ensure the survival of the colony. Supply ships and additional settlers arrived, but not in great numbers. Several other settlements were established in the area as the colony grew, generally radiating out from Plymouth. You can see this evolution in the dates that the surrounding towns were established. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoags did eventually have conflict, as they competed for resources and the indigenous tribes began to feel threatened by the arrival of more English in 1630. While the Pilgrims struggled for many of their first years, they were followed into the area by a much larger and better organized group known as the Puritans, who prospered more quickly. These settlers were also challenging the Church of England, but sought to purify its practices and return to a simpler style of worship. They were also challenged by the English monarchy, but did not flee England as the Pilgrims had. This group formed the Massachusetts Bay Company, which would be responsible for provisioning the colony and for sending additional migrants. In 1630, the first Puritans arrived. There were several hundred settlers on about a dozen ships. They first went to Salem and then settled in what is today Charlestown, but moved to the Shawmut Peninsula and renamed it Boston. John Winthrop was one of its leaders. As you can see from this map, additional settlements quickly followed. Between 1630 and 1640, there was a large migration of Puritans from England to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a number that many estimate at around 40,000. When the English Civil War broke out in England, the Puritans dethroned Charles I and ruled England under Oliver Cromwell. The migrations slowed, and some Puritans even left Boston to return to England. Remember that their original goal was to establish a place where they could practice their religion freely, and now they could do so back in England. Those that remained oversaw the growth and evolution of the colony. They established a colonial legislature called the General Court, and the colony prospered. Medfield was established in 1651 by this Puritan migration. At that time, Medfield was a frontier town, a farming community that flourished along the Charles River. The Puritan migration continued throughout New England. Along with their English history and customs that they shared with the other colonies, those in Massachusetts shared a common religious background. Economic life focused on their church, farms, and small towns, and education. The southern colonies educated their children, though mostly the children of the elites, but in Massachusetts and New England, education was particularly important and widespread. Most children were taught to read so they could read the Bible, a key part of their Protestant theology. Also, they sought to train new clergy. In order to do so, colleges were established, Harvard being the oldest, having been founded in 1636. Remember that these were colonies established to practice religion as they deemed proper. The Puritans and Pilgrims were not tolerant of others who challenged the status quo. If people challenged the church elders, those challengers were punished. Roger Williams grew discontent with the way that religion was being practiced in Boston and left to establish his own colony in Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson was another famous dissident who was banished after leading services to mixed groups of men and women. They both questioned the theological practices of the colony's clerical elite. Mary Dyer was a Quaker who was banished and then executed after she returned to Massachusetts in 1660, as Quakerism was not tolerated. The Puritans and Pilgrims came to the New World for religious freedom, but it took many years until they extended that right to others. This is the end of Part 3. At this time, please complete the comprehension check titled Unit 1 Comprehension Check 3, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. As I mentioned previously, it is interesting to think about how these 13 colonies went from being part of the empire to declaring independence. From 1607 through 1763, over 150 years, there had been little indication that trouble was brewing. Yet within 12 years, from 1763 to 1775, conditions deteriorated enough so that these 13 British colonies declared their independence in 1776. Of course, the period of rising tension did have its roots in events and policies that occurred during the time of growth and peace. One of the long-term causes of tension after the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, was salutary neglect. Over the preceding decades, the English colonies thrived. They provided key resources for England and its other colonies in the Caribbean, and in return imported finished goods from England. England underwent significant turmoil during the 17th century with 2 civil wars, but also reaped the economic benefits of a period of industrialization. This period also saw the continued expansion of the British Empire as it established colonies in India and elsewhere, and the central government in London left its colonies in North America alone for much of the first half of the 18th century. During that time, the colonies basically administered themselves. This period of salutary neglect, where laws passed by Parliament in Britain may or may not have been enforced by the Crown and its officials in the colonies. Import duties may have been collected or not. This left the colonies to exercise local governance to a degree that created tension when the Crown and Parliament tried to reassert its control after the French and Indian War. The General Court of Massachusetts, the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and all of the other colonial legislatures dealt with local issues independently of Parliament, though often in conjunction with the royal governor. Think about salutary neglect and how it was difficult for the colonies to be more directly administered from London. As the English colonies grew along the Atlantic coast, they inevitably came to challenge those who had lived in these lands for centuries. The Native Americans had been decimated by the diseases that the English and other Europeans brought to the New World, so were in a difficult position to fight the English. Several major wars broke out between various colonies and tribes. Jamestown settlers fought the Powhatans in the 1620s. The Pequot War of 1639 in New England resulted in atrocities by both the English and the Native Americans. King Philip's War of 1675 to 1676 embroiled many towns in wars, with many like Medfield burned during the conflict. These conflicts steadily moved west as the English solidified their position and more settlements were established. During the 18th century, the French often provided Native Americans with assistance in their struggles with the British, and the Indians helped the French as European rivalries spilled over into North America, and wars were fought between Britain and France. In the end, by the 1750s, the frontier had moved to the Great Lakes region and the Appalachian Mountains. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and the other settlements in the east were well protected, and the Native Americans broken and driven into the Ohio River Valley. This is the end of part 4, a short part, but at this point, please complete the comprehension check titled Unit 1 Comprehension Check 4, Long-Term Causes of Conflict. By the 1750s, the colonies once again faced conflict with the French and struggled with increased attacks by the Native Americans. Part of this was in response to land speculators and others who crossed the Appalachian Mountains into French territory and began to establish English settlements there. The French and Indians pushed back, and by 1754 the conflict loomed. In response to this tension, Benjamin Franklin led an effort to unite the colonies against continued conflict with the Native Americans and the French. He proposed the Albany Plan of Union, which would keep the colonies closely tied to the Crown, but would create a colonial council that would provide for the protection of the colonies against the French and Indians. At the Albany Congress, 7 colonies met to consider Franklin's plan. He published the cartoon of the snake you see here as a way to influence public opinion. The Congress was not successful, and war soon broke out between Britain and France. But this was an attempt to bring the 13 colonies together into one loose union. George Washington, a young militia officer from Virginia, was involved in one of the earliest skirmishes between the British and colonial forces and the French. Different Indian tribes allied themselves with either the British or the French and sometimes switched sides during the ensuing conflict, which became known as the French and Indian War. The Virginians tried to establish a fort named Fort Pitt in the Ohio River Valley, where Pittsburgh is today. The French, who owned this territory, kicked the Virginians out and renamed it Fort Duquesne. The Virginians returned, joined by regular soldiers from Britain, and this battle sparked a global war between the two empires. In North America, many colonial militias fought in engagements up and down the frontier. Those in New England were involved in battles in Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Montreal. When the British conquered Quebec in 1760 under the leadership of General Wolfe, the war mostly ended in favor of Great Britain. Montreal fell soon after, and what had started as a skirmish for a lonely fort resulted in the French ceding all of their claims in North America to the British. Britain now owned all of the lands between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River, except for Florida, which was still controlled by Spain. The stage was set for the colonies to expand, but also for tension to arise as Parliament and the Crown sought to administer this new territory. In 12 years, another war would begin, the American War for Independence. A new king, King George III, rose to the throne in 1761 and would rule Great Britain for the next 60 years. This ends part 5 of the unit and the unit itself. Please take the last comprehension check named Unit 1 Comprehension Check 5, the French and Indian War.